Hi there team, welcome back to the channel, welcome back to Worth It Then, Worth It Now, an ongoing side project I run here on this channel where I look at games from yesteryear. 10 years plus removed, and I line it up with a sale where possible. Today, we're talking about Mordheim, City of the Damned. I haven't played this in a while actually, and to be perfectly honest, it holds up a lot better than I remembered. Not that I ever thought that this was bad or anything like that, but I always acknowledged it was a pretty valiant attempt at something near and dear to my heart. And given the time it came out and, you know, the surge of indie interest, it was kind of a unique game, this turn-based warband management, but very much, I would say, console or controller friendly by design. I'm not using those controls or anything like that, but you can feel it with the mouse and keyboard. It is kind of locked into that third-person perspective. You find yourself toggling into an overworld map a bit to figure out what's going on. Dare I say, if you're used to turn-based strategy, managing a team, that sort of game on PC, you might feel the limitations of their attempt to hybridize the format. But still, like I said, coming back to this, I was a little bit worried. I was like, oh, is it going to hold up? And, you know, graphically it shows its age. And again, mechanically, it was one of those things that was trying something new that, depending on your tolerance, may or may not land. But yeah, I'm actually really quite enjoying this. But again, my biases are pretty clear. I'm a huge Mordheim fan. Anyway, at the time of this recording, it's going on ultra deep sale. We're talking $2 to pick up, so it might just be worth throwing some of that extra Steam wallet money and giving it a go, because I think it's good. It is, but again, there are caveats as well. I'm not going to try and blow smoke up you and say it's the greatest game you never played. So let's peel it back. Mordheim is part of the Games Workshop tabletop universe, which you're probably more familiar with, Warhammer 40,000. That's a really popular one. They also had Warhammer Fantasy, or the old world, the end times, whatever you want to call it. These days, you've got Age of Sigmar. It was kind of a reboot of that setting. But, you know, the popular Total Warhammer franchise, you know, Total Warhammer 3, that's all set in the same universe as this game, as Mordheim, as the original fantasy setting, where it was about regimental unit blocks moving on the tabletop. So Mordheim comes along in my youth, we're talking decades ago now, as a spin-off warband version of that fantasy gameplay. So you would field fantasy armies, like I said, of line regiments, 2,500 points, lots and lots of models, we're talking hundreds. But in Mordheim, it was more about, you know, 8 models max, that sort of thing. And I absolutely loved it. And me and my group of friends, we played it. You know, we'd have pizza weekends and square off against each other in these little pitched battles, 1v1s springing up all over the place. And the real unique beauty of Mordheim was the permanency of your warband. There was an RPG component, which was something that you don't have in Warhammer. Like, you build your list for the tournament or the comp or the battle or whatever, but that's about it. There's no permanency, there's no meta behind it. And with Mordheim, you know, you guys could get permanent injuries, they could get an eyeball poked out. Actually, they could get both, and if that case, they had to be retired. But, you know, I'm pretty sure you could get peg legs and lose arms and legs, and you could change the weapons that they were carrying. And you know, Games Workshop being as predatory as they were very big on, well, you know, your model has to represent your dude and, you know, trying to squeeze as much money out of you as possible. But I digress. Long and short of it is, it's smaller scale, it's set in that fantasy Warhammer universe, and it's got an RPG permanency that you would see, you know, I suppose in something like a turn-based strategy, not really an XCOM, because it has a bit more complexity with permanent injuries and upgrades and equipment. And so here comes Rogue Factor doing this with middling success, and I think it's a pretty good translation of the tabletop that I love so fondly. It is probably worth mentioning as well, they fielded a go at Necromunda years later, which, by the way, Necromunda is to Warhammer 40,000 what Mordheim is to Warhammer Fantasy. Necromunda is ultimately the 40k future version of Mordheim, warband management but with guns. And that kind of flopped because they really did something wrong with the AI, and I must go back and check that out. But more recently, they actually released Hell is Us, which is a bit of a departure from that previous method, but I think they really found stride. That was one of my favourite games of last year. It's really cool, kind of gritty and grim, but interesting as well. Third-person action combat. But anyway, to stay with Mordheim, I know I've given you a little bit of a history lesson. It distills down that vibe, right? You pick from, I think there's 6 different warbands you can choose. And the setting, by the way, Mordheim is a city within that old world setting. And it's very prosperous and rich and kind of decadent. It's a bit of a Sodom and Gomorrah story because it gets hit by this green meteor from outer space or whatever, and people generally consider it to be God's wrath upon mankind, right? Anyway, so this city in the Warhammer setting is absolutely decimated by this impact, and from it you get this green crystal, this weird stone, which is very valuable, and it creates this kind of, the Division's dark zone, this cordoned off no-go area, but high value if you want to go in there. And so the different warbands go in for different reasons. There are sort of Sigma priests that are in there trying to cleanse, and it attracts chaos and Skaven. But the standard poster boy of Mordheim is the human mercenary types from Middenheim and Marienburg, and it goes into these empire towns that don't really get a spotlight in the fantasy wider setting. And so that's why I've gone, because why not? That's the fantasy, right? Being this human slapdash mercenary group going in there trying to smuggle out weird stone. So your game plays out in a split loop. You have your management screen, which, there's a lot of numbers and stats and moving parts, but funnily enough, you get your head around it pretty quickly. Ultimately, you hire dudes into your warband, and depending on your warband's level, that limits how many guys you can have. And the individual dudes will level up as well their RPG sheet, essentially for just rocking up to a battle. Getting knocked out in a fight is not necessarily death. However, the threshold for death is different for different classes. You've kind of just got your meat men basic troopers, but then you have your captain, who is a much more robust, realized, and death is much rarer. He'll get injured, right? Injury on the lower level dudes is kind of rare. And then in between, you sort of have your lieutenants, your aspiring young champions to be. So they all level up just from earning experience passively or from doing feats of knocking down enemies. You line up your warband, you buy goods that, refresh, or you scavenge, but it's not super flush. So there is very much that scavenger mentality. Like, I've put some heavy armor on my warband leader and he looks pretty Gucci. And then you go into a battle, you do one battle per turn. You can scout the map to look for better opportunities, and it varies. Even in just this brief time doing B-roll, I've played against Chaos, Sigma priests. There was another faction actually as well. And so you take turns, right? And there are weaknesses. It seems to play out the enemy turn in real time even when it's hidden. So you might find yourself sitting there waiting for a little while the enemy moves around. Whatever, so it is. It's not so bad, to be honest. And what your dudes can do is moderately limited. You're kind of trying to scavenge for weird stone and supplies and that sort of stuff. And depending on the scenario, you might be ambushed. You might have to protect your cart. It might just be a pitched battle. But it's one of those things that once you do see the enemy, it becomes a bit of a pile in, let's see who's still standing, jam as many dudes into the melee scrum as you can. And once you fall below a certain threshold of guys going down, you start having to take route tests, and essentially you're on borrowed time. So there is this sort of halfway threshold. Once you lose, you start with 5 guys, and after you lose about 2 models, you're probably gonna start losing or routing, right? So that's how most battles end. You lose a chunk of dudes, you go below the morale threshold, you start route testing until you fail. The winner not quite takes all, but they get a chunk of whatever's left on the map. So there is a strategy, like if you're in a warband lineup and you're going to get absolutely thumped by the other team, maybe you just hide from them or avoid them or try and kite them around while your other dudes pick up weird stone and all that. So when you do eventually rout, you turn a bit of a profit. So, there are layers to it. And on top of it, there is a campaign through line of missions that you have to do. I remember a particularly nasty one having to fight a rat ogre, but I'm not up to it this time around. And all of this, you have to keep sending weird stone home to your faction. I guess it's different for each one, but like in the human sense, that's what you have to do. So you're saving up certain tonnage to send back in a shipment before the timer runs out. It's good, it's fun, it's involved. It does become, a little bit of a elbows everywhere scrum when you do make contact with the enemy, and for the most part, you dudes are like attack or dodge, and that's about it. Like, a lot of the fight is won in who starts seeing whom first, and whatever equipment or even upgrades your guys have from surviving certain battles. But, there's a uniqueness to it that I quite like. And again, to reiterate, in my mind, while I have a soft spot, I thought it was going to be rougher than it actually is, and I'm pleasantly surprised to come back and enjoy it as much as I am, and to in turn share it with you. So it's a couple of bucks, maybe check it out. You might just fall in love with it. It might be just the janky old classic that you missed or misremembered that you're looking for right now. Anyway, team, might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.